Welcome to this New Nutrition Business podcast. My name's Julian Mellentin, and it's my great good fortune to spend all of my life working in the field of food, nutrition, and health. And what our company is best known for is our annual 10 Key Trends analysis, which has been going for some 20 years and is used by companies around the world. And I'm taking a slightly different perspective today. So, when we think about nutrition and health and the future, we think about consumer research, we think about technology, changes in people's living habits, and it's always very future focused. This podcast is about some history. Most people in the food industry, and in fact in our society generally, barely give history a moment's thought. After all, they say to themselves, how can things that happened long ago help us with strategy and innovation today? But in fact, history can be helpful, particularly if you're involved in producing food and in innovation. It's really useful to have a handle on the history of food and what timeless lessons about humans it can teach us that we can still apply today. And that's because humans are rather prone to doing the same things over and over again. We don't actually change very much over the centuries. We have similar desires and needs, and that's contrary to what you will often see in social media and what's claimed by the Silicon Valley tech bros who seem to think that humans are just perpetual white pages on which you can write something new all the time and transform them. And the idea of humans being a blank slate on which you can write whatever you want is it's worth bearing in mind that that may sound all right, but it was a view that underpinned some of the most murderous ideologies of the 20th century. I'm not going to talk about murderous ideologies today. That's the last reference. Now, Winston Churchill, you may have heard of him. He did not doubt that we can learn from the past. He said, and I quote, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Another time he said something that qualifies this, which is that history does not repeat itself, but people do. And that's the really important thing. That's what I was alluding to just now by saying that people's wants, needs, desires don't change. History does not repeat itself, but humans pretty much stay the same. So history is a rich seam of experience where we can find examples and case studies that throw light on what we're doing today. So my case study today is the history of coffee and how it helps us understand why and how people adopt new foods and new beverages. For most of human history, coffee was unknown outside a small region of Ethiopia. It seems absolutely fundamental to our world today, but it's been consumed in the West only in the last 4 centuries. There is no coffee mentioned in the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran. There is no coffee mentioned in Shakespeare or the works of Dante. Coffee gained its first foothold in the Arab world, where it was called koffa. That in Latin script is C-O-F-F-A, derived from the Arabic word for the berries from which coffee, the drink, was made. As late as 1550 in Istanbul, the capital of modern-day Turkey, and then the capital of the Ottoman Empire, coffee drinking was considered something of an innovation, a new idea and an alien concept. But it caught on, and it wasn't until 1650, 100 years after that, that the first coffee house in the Western world opened in London, with the second opening in The Hague, the capital city of the Netherlands, in 1664, and the first in America, in Boston, in 1690. At the time, Western societies had no habit of drinking hot beverages, not even tea, which came along later. People drank mostly beer, wine, or water, though you had to be very careful with the water. Unless you had your own spring or a good source, it might make you sick. So there was a tendency to lean towards drinking beer as a way of protecting yourself against disease. And most people would begin their day with a glass of beer, which must have made life a lot more pleasant, perhaps. So coffee came along as this completely new, unknown, and exotic thing. It had an unsavory appearance and a very unfamiliar bitter flavor that some people said tasted like boiled soot or burned leather. But one of the pleasing aspects of drinking coffee was that it did not make you drunk. And in fact, they discovered that drinking coffee made you feel brighter and more alert than drinking alcohol. And employers noticed that drinking coffee made their workers more sober and more industrious. Coffee sharpened minds, such that when people went to coffee houses, which was where coffee was served at first, not at home, They would sit there and feeling sharp, they would discuss the news, politics, religion, and all sorts of things. And when people began to think more clearly and to discuss amongst themselves, this new beverage inevitably became a source of concern to governments because people were getting together to drink it with heads unbefuddled, and they're able to discuss whether it was okay for the king to randomly imprison people or why aristocrats owned all the land. And this discussion began to ferment all sorts of new ideas. It's possibly no coincidence that the Enlightenment, that great period in the 18th century when most of our ideas about human rights and democracy were created, the Enlightenment followed on from the arrival of coffee, from the drop in alcohol consumption and the increase in drinking, something that sharpened people's minds. Poets praised the stimulating effect of coffee on creativity. It became clear to early scientists that coffee's effects on sleep and keeping people sharp and awake were its most compelling benefits. But it wasn't until 1819 that the active component in coffee, caffeine, was isolated by a German chemist called Runge, and he was working at the request of Goethe, the great German literary figure, the Shakespeare of Germany, if you like. So there's huge adoption of coffee. And it's a perfect example of a disruptive innovation, a term many of you will be familiar with, coined by Harvard Business School researcher Clayton Christensen back in 1995. He defined a disruptive innovation as a product that overturns the existing status quo or creates new markets. And coffee definitely did that. Now, not everyone liked the taste of coffee. So if they could afford it, they sweetened it with sugar. And thus, coffee became the direct ancestor of Red Bull and all energy drinks, a sweetened, caffeinated beverage that people drank to stimulate their mind and body. Energy drinks, as we know them in the West, debuted in the late 80s, early 90s, led by Red Bull, the great pioneer. One of the reasons that Red Bull is successful is because it delivers 75 milligrams of caffeine per 250 milliliter can. That's a benefit that people can feel. It sharpens people up in the afternoon or enables them to go on partying all night long. And it is that giving you wings effect, as Red Bull calls it, that's helped make energy drinks the most successful beverage category on the planet. I think the last time I looked, sales of energy drinks were well above 50 billion US dollars a year. Now, as an aside, Red Bull actually first debuted in Thailand in 1973. And in fact, energy drinks as we know them today were created in Japan, where the first brand, called Lipo Vitan, debuted in 1964. And as an aside to the aside, never lose sight of the fact that many products in Western markets, which we see as innovations, originated from far away, from Asia in particular, just as coffee came from Turkey or Ethiopia via Turkey. So Asia is particularly important when it comes to innovation. I would argue that Asia has now overtaken the West in terms of innovation. So back to the story. Coffee delivers, just like Red Bull, a feel the benefit effect. And feel the benefit is something which our customers know we talk about often. If you can create a product where people can feel the benefit in some shape or form, that is the most compelling message for lots of people and a compelling reason to keep on buying the product. Now, that's not possible with a lot of benefits. But if you look at the whole world of GLP-1A drugs, which is a huge frenzy at the moment, what's the benefit people can feel? They see themselves losing weight very quickly. So that's a kind of like the biggest and most prominent example of if you can think of a way to make the feel the benefit work in your product, you should. That feel the benefit effect is what helped make coffee such an enormous success so quickly. Now, just now, I cited coffee as a perfect example of a disruptive innovation. And in the food industry, we often fall into the trap of believing that disruptive innovation is something that will be completely new to the consumer. And we think of that in terms of a new technology or a totally new food or beverage. Now, that's true in many areas of technological innovation, but in food, it's not always true. In recent years, some of the most successful innovations in food and beverage have been about reinventing traditional foods. And one of the best examples is Greek yogurt. It's a very traditional product from Greece. It was taken to the US and marketed by a Turkish entrepreneur, debuting in America in 2007. It succeeded because even though it was just yogurt, it gave American consumers a step change in their taste and texture experience, and it was greatly superior to anything that they'd been able to buy and consume before. Greek yogurt was up against the then market leader, Yoplait, whose yogurts were very thin, very sweet, almost like confectionery. As a European traveling frequently in the US, they were something that I definitely avoided at the hotel breakfast buffet. In fact, I was completely baffled why anyone would eat these filthy sweet products. Greek yogurt also had a traditional backstory, and that's something that humans love to hear. They like the idea that the new food that they're being offered isn't so new, that it's been traditionally consumed already by people somewhere else. That kind of reassures you that it must be okay if your fellow humans have been consuming it for a long time. So that love of a backstory, which obviously is very powerful for Greek yogurt, was also true for the introduction of coffee. It benefited from the reassuring backstory about being commonly consumed in Turkey. And you remember at that stage, Turkey in the Ottoman Empire was immensely wealthy and powerful in the Mediterranean. So it was a place that everyone had heard of and a place that was associated with interesting new products. Now, Greek yogurt, of course, has the protein benefit, but that wasn't what propelled sales in America so dramatically in the first, say, 3 to 5 years. The protein frenzy that we're familiar with today didn't really kick off till about 2012, and even then it was still quite small. It was a similar story in China, where Yili launched Greek yogurt and created a multi-billion-dollar brand, with the success being for the same reasons as in the US, a step change in taste and texture, and the reassurance that this was a traditional food enjoyed by fellow humans somewhere else. The protein message came along much later. So in food, bringing a traditional product from somewhere else where it is everyday and boring, taking it to a new market where it's new and exciting, but it has a reassuring and interesting backstory, that is a strategy that means you'll hit a lot of the right buttons with most consumers. Now, coffee, the original energy drink, has been progressively reinvented over the past 10 years. The family-owned Swedish coffee company Löfbergs, which is the biggest coffee producer in Sweden, told us several years ago that, quote, "We see that the next generation of coffee drinkers don't really drink coffee in the same way that we used to." So that Swedish producer was one of the pioneers in the past 10 years of coffee getting a complete makeover. And coffee has gone from being something which for older consumers was just something you consume in a cup that's hot, to being for younger consumers something you can consume in lots of different ways. And one of the most important changes is the delivery of coffee in the form of a chilled, ready-to-drink beverage in cans or in coffee-type cups, usually with dairy, such as Starbucks coffee and milk drink, or in Europe, the Emmy Cafe Latte. And in both of those cases, we're talking about brands with hundreds of millions of dollars of sales. It's a similar story in every country around the world. Asahi, for example, has been very successful with that portable, chilled coffee and dairy beverage form. So these drinks become more convenient, very portable, but still deliver the benefit of sharpening you up. And that helps keep coffee just as relevant and important today as it was 400 years ago. In our industry, we love technology. We talk about it in meetings all the time. We talk about consumers and consumer insights. But to be frank, we do this of necessity in a way which is just a little bit isolated, because we don't always take a step back and say, what has happened before? How do we get to where we are today? And I'm not suggesting you devote your meetings to this, but it is important just to have a bit of a handle on where we've come from. Psychologists have a word for this narrow view, which is nowism. And they suggest that in the 21st century, we're more prone to nowism in the West than has been the case in the past. I don't know whether that's true or not. Now, you tell your colleagues that understanding some food history can help you do a better job with new product development and innovation, and they will look at you in a very odd way. That's not their fault. It's the fault of our education system. It is really important, even in producing food, to have your head wrapped around the before as well as the present and the future. How do we get to where we are today? What lessons are there that we can take out of that? What does it tell us about humans? And why does that matter? Because humans don't change all that much, even over hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. I hope you found this podcast enjoyable. If you've listened to it all the way to the end, thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to know more about New Nutrition Business, please go to our website, www.new-nutrition.com, and you will find a ton of useful information there. I hope you have a lovely day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye.